You know, sometimes a spot has more than just old memories. It carries the heavy load of all the dreams that died there. The Mallister Ranch in the Montana Territory is sitting all abandoned. It's like a proof of how fast hope can turn to dust when luck turns away. Broken fences, a sagging barn, fields full of weeds. The people in the nearby town of Copper Ridge shake their heads every time they pass by, sure that nothing good will ever come from that cursed land again. Then one quiet morning, a big guy rides in by himself. He doesn't talk a lot. He just looks at the mess in front of him and sees something no one else can. The town people laugh when he starts fixing things, thinking he's a fool. But what they don't know is what one stubborn guy can do when he won't quit. Can he really bring this dead ranch back to life? Before we go on, tell us where you're listening from. And if this story touches you, subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra cool saved for you. The guy's name was Jacob Stone, and he was 57 years old, though the lines on his weathered face showed a story of tougher years than that. He stood 6'5" tall with wide shoulders that had carried more loads than any guy should have to. His hands were rough and scarred from years of ranch work, and his eyes had the special kind of sadness that comes from losing everything you ever loved. He had ridden into Copper Ridge 3 days earlier, leading a single pack horse loaded with tools, supplies, and all he owned in this world. The town wasn't much to talk about, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, and a few homes that stuck to the dusty road like they were scared to go too far from town. Montana Territory in 1885 was still wild country where a guy could vanish into the big open space and never be heard from again. Jacob had stopped first at the general store, a beaten-up building with a faded sign that read, Hayes Mercantile. Inside, the owner was a woman in her early 60s named Martha Hayes, with silver hair tied back in a simple bun and eyes that saw everything. She had looked up from her book when Jacob came in, taking in his worn-out clothes and the quiet way he moved. "Can I help you?" she had asked, not in a mean way. "Need some supplies?" Jacob said, his voice rough from not talking much and dust. "I'm looking for the old Mallister place." Martha's face changed, then something between surprise and worry showed on her face. "The Mallister Ranch. That place has been empty for almost 5 years now. Nothing there but mess and bad memories." "That's the one I'm after," Jacob replied simply. She had looked at him for a long moment before talking again. "You family to the Macalisters?" "No, ma'am." "Bought the deed from the bank in Helena?" "Paid cash for it 3 weeks ago." Martha's eyebrows went up at that. "Wow, that's bold of you. Most people around here think that land is cursed." Nothing but sadness came from it. She stopped, then added more softly, "But I guess every guy has a right to make his own mistakes. What supplies do you need?" Jacob had given her his list. Basic food, nails, rope, lamp oil, and Martha had filled his order quickly, though he caught her looking at him with clear curiosity a few times. When he went to pay, she surprised him by offering credit. "You'll need it if you're serious about fixing that place." She said, "I've got your name in my book now." "You seem like an honest guy, Jacob Stone. Don't prove me wrong." He had thanked her and left, feeling the weight of her trust in him like a stone in his chest. It had been a long time since anyone had given him trust so easily. The sheriff had been his next stop. Tom Brennan was a thin guy in his mid-40s with a steel-gray mustache and the careful eyes of someone who had learned not to take anything for granted. He had looked over Jacob's deed with professional care, asked a few sharp questions about where Jacob had come from and what his plans were, then nodded and handed the papers back. "Seems in order," Brennan had said. "Though I'll tell you straight, Dale Hutchins has been looking at that property for years. Tried to buy it twice from the bank before they finally took it. He won't be happy someone else got it first." "Who's Dale Hutchins?" "Richest rancher in 3 counties. Owns most of the good grazing land east of here. He's used to getting what he wants." The sheriff had looked at Jacob with a straight stare. "You planning on staying or just looking to sell the property for profit?" "Planning on staying," Jacob had answered quietly. "Planning on making it work?" Something in his tone must have made Brennan happy, because the sheriff had nodded and offered his hand. "Then I wish you luck, Mr. Stone. You're going to need it." That had been 3 days ago. Now standing in the doorway of what had once been the main house of the Mallister Ranch, Jacob could see exactly what everyone in town had been talking about. The place was a disaster. The house itself was a 2-story building that might have been nice once. Built from good wood and river stone, but years of no care had done damage. The porch sagged badly on one side. Several windows were broken and the front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Inside was worse dust and trash everywhere. Furniture rotting where it had been left. Holes in the ceiling where the roof had given way. The barn was in a bit better shape. Strong structure but worn and needing fixes. The fences that had once closed in the property had fallen in most spots. Posts leaning at crazy angles or lying flat in the tall grass. What had been fields were now covered with sagebrush and weeds. The corral gates hung open, one completely off its hinges, but there was water. Jacob had checked that first thing and found the well near the house still there, though dry right now. The creek that ran along the northern edge still flowed in seasons but steady. The land itself was good. He could see that under the neglect, rich soil in the low land near the creek, good grazing on the gentle hills, and enough wood on the higher ground for building and fuel dot. It was evening now, his first night on the property. Jacob had cleared a space in the main room of the house, swept away the worst of the trash, and laid out his bedroll. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, eating cold beans straight from the can and looking at the work that lay ahead of him. Dot. It was a lot when he let himself think about it. One guy, no money to speak of, trying to bring back a dead ranch. The smart thing would be to walk away, sell the deed to this Dale Hutchkins guy, and try something easier somewhere else. But Jacob was done with easy. Easy hadn't saved his first ranch when the drought came. Easy hadn't kept his wife Elizabeth alive when the fever took her. Easy had led him to 6 years of drifting from job to job, town to town, slowly losing parts of himself until he barely knew the guy in the mirror. This place, this broken, forgotten piece of Montana, was his last chance, not just to build a ranch, but to prove to himself that he wasn't done, that the best parts of him hadn't died with Elizabeth and everything else he had lost dawn as the last light faded from the sky. Jacob lit his lantern and looked around the house more carefully. In what had been the main bedroom upstairs, he found a wooden trunk pushed against the wall. The lock was rusted through, and it opened easily when he pried it. Dot inside, under a layer of moth-eaten blankets, he found a leather-bound journal. The cover was marked with the initials SM, and when he opened it carefully, the first page had a note in nice handwriting. The journal of Sarah Mallister began this first day of January, 1876. Jacob carried the journal back downstairs and sat by his lantern, turning the pages slowly. Sarah Mallister had been a careful writer of ranch life. Her notes told everything from cattle numbers to weather patterns, from recipes to notes about which fields gave the best hay. But more than that, her words painted a picture of a life that had been full and rich. She wrote about her husband John, their 2 sons, and the pride they took in building something lasting. She described neighbors helping with the harvest, dances in the barn, the first time their youngest boy successfully broke a horse on his own. The journal was a record of normal days made special by the love and care with which she had lived them. But as Jacob read forward through the years, the tone began to change. Entries became shorter, more worried. Mentions of a brother, someone named Dale, who had left to marry into a rich family and refused to help when drought began to take its toll. Then the death of the eldest son in a riding accident. John's failing health. The devastating loss of their cattle herd in the brutal winter of 1879. The final entry was dated March 15, 1880. John passed this morning. The boys and I will leave for Oregon in the spring. There is nothing left for us here but ghosts and sorrow. I pray that someday this land will know happiness again. It deserves better than we could give it. Jacob closed the journal carefully, feeling the weight of Sarah McAllister's grief across the years. But under the sadness, he felt something else, a sense of connection, of responsibility. She had loved this place. She had poured her heart into it, and she had hoped, even in her darkest moment, that it might flourish again. He looked around at the ruined house, at the dust and decay and years of abandonment. Then he looked down at his own scarred hands, still strong despite everything they had been through. "I'll do my best, Mrs. Mallister," he said quietly to the empty room. "I'll do my best to make this place live again." Outside, the Montana night was huge and full of stars. The wind whispered through the broken fences and overgrown fields. And in the darkness, if you listened carefully, you might have heard the first stirring of something that had been dead for far too long. The sound of hope, fragile but persistent, beginning to take root once more. Dotner Jacob woke before dawn on his 4th day at the ranch, as was his habit. The morning air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant pine. He made coffee over a small fire outside, watching the sun paint the eastern hills gold and red, and began planning his day's work. The well was his priority. Without reliable water, nothing else mattered. He was halfway through his second cup when he heard the sound of horses approaching. 3 riders came up the overgrown path to the house, moving with the easy confidence of men who owned everything they surveyed. The man in front sat his horse like he was posing for a portrait straight back, dressed fancy in a tailored vest and fine leather boots that had never seen a day's real work. Jacob stood slowly, setting down his cup, and waited. The lead rider pulled in his horse 20 ft away, looking down at Jacob with an expression that managed to be both nice and looking down on him. He was maybe 50 years old, clean-shaven with the kind of smooth features that came from a lifetime of ease. His 2 companions were younger, clearly ranch hands, and they positioned themselves slightly behind their boss with the watchful stillness of men who knew how to handle trouble. "You must be Jacob Stone," the lead man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I'm Dale Hutchkins. I own the Double H Ranch about 8 miles east of here. Mr. Hutchkins." Jacob acknowledged with a slight nod. Dale smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll be direct with you, Mr. Stone. I've been interested in this property for some time. Made several offers to the bank before they put it up for auction. Unfortunately, I was out of state on business and missed the opportunity to bid." He paused, letting that sink in. "But I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer right now. Double what you paid for it. That's pure profit for less than a week's ownership." Jacob considered the man carefully before responding. "Appreciate the offer, Mr. Hutchkins, but I didn't buy this land to sell it. I bought it to work it." Dale's smile thinned slightly. "Mr. Stone, I don't think you understand what you're taking on here. This ranch failed. The Mallisters were good people, hard-working people, and they couldn't make it work. What makes you think you can succeed where they failed?" "Don't know that I will," Jacob said evenly. "But I aim to try. That's admirable, if misguided." Dale shifted in his saddle, his tone becoming more pointed. "Let me be frank. This land borders my property. I have plans for expansion, and this particular section would allow me to control access to some key water sources. I need this land, Mr. Stone, and I'm willing to pay well for it. Land's not for sale." The pleasant mask slipped from Dale's face for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. Then he recovered, forcing another smile. "Think about it. A man your age? Taking on a project like this alone, it's not practical. There's no shame in accepting a good business deal." "I already thought about it," Jacob replied. Answer still no. Dale stared at him for a long moment, and Jacob could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. Finally, the rancher nodded slowly. "Well, can't say I didn't try to be neighborly." He gathered his reins. "You'll find that life out here can be difficult for a man without friends. Mr. Stone, I hope you won't come to regret your decision." There was no mistaking the threat in those words, polite as they were. Dale turned his horse around and rode off, his men following. Jacob watched them go, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest. He had dealt with men like Dale Hutchkins before, men who believed their money and influence made them entitled to anything they wanted. He picked up his coffee cup, found it had gone cold, and dumped it out. No sense dwelling on trouble that hadn't arrived yet. He had work to do. Jacob spent the morning gathering tools from the barn: shovel, a pickaxe, rope, and a rusted hand pump he hoped he could fix to working order. The well was about 30 ft deep, lined with stones that seemed solid enough, but when he lowered a bucket, it came up empty. Something was blocking the water source. By mid-morning, Sheriff Brennan rode up, getting off his horse with the easy way of a guy who spent most of his life on horseback. "Morning, Jacob. Thought I'd check in, see how you're settling." "Morning, Sheriff." Jacob pointed toward the well. "Just trying to figure out why this well's gone dry. Water level should be good here." Brennan looked down into the darkness. "Mallisters never had trouble with it, far as I recall. Could be trash built up after all these years." He glanced at Jacob. "Dale Hutchins was in town this morning. Seemed irritated about something. He stopped by, made me an offer on the land, and you turned him down." "I did." The sheriff nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already guessed. "Dale's not used to hearing no. His father built the Double H from nothing, but Dale inherited it. He spent his whole life buying his way out of problems." Brennan pulled out a worn tobacco pouch and began rolling a cigarette. "You should know something, Jacob. Dale's got power around here. He funds half the businesses in town, sits on the bank board, has the ear of the territorial governor. If he decides to make life hard for you, he's got the ways to do it. Figured as much, Jacob said, but that doesn't change my answer. Didn't expect it would. Brennan lit his cigarette and looked at Jacob through the smoke. You strike me as a guy who's been through some things. Man like that doesn't scare easy. He paused. But be careful all the same. Dale fights with lawyers and politicians and leverage. Not always easy to defend against that kind of warfare. Appreciate the warning, Sheriff. After Brennan left, Jacob went back to checking the well. He made a torch from rags soaked in lamp oil and lowered it carefully on a rope, trying to see what was blocking the water. About 20 FT down, he could make out what looked like a collapsed section of the stone lining. Rocks and trash had formed a dam preventing water from flowing up from the source. Thought it would mean going down into the well himself. A dangerous thing for a guy working alone. But without water, the ranch was worthless. Jacob had no choice. He rigged a safety rope around his chest, tied it off to the strongest post of the well frame, and began his descent. The stones were slippery with moss and wetness, and the air got cool and damp as he lowered himself deeper. His shoulders barely fit in the narrow shaft, and more than one time he had to stop and control his breathing when the walls seemed to press in around him. 20 FT. He reached the blockage. Working by feel more than sight, he began carefully removing rocks and pushing them deeper into the well shaft below him, where there was room for them to fall away. It was slow, careful work. His hands were soon bleeding from scrapes against the rough stone, and his back screamed from the awkward position. Then he felt a shift in the trash, followed by the sound of water beginning to flow. Cold liquid suddenly rushed around his feet, rising fast. Jacob grabbed the safety rope and began pulling himself up hand over hand as the water level climbed beneath him. His arms burned with the effort, his grip slipping on the wet rope, but he forced himself upward with grim determination. He broke into sunlight, gasping, pulling himself over the edge of the well and collapsing on the ground beside it. For several minutes, he simply lay there, chest heaving, tasting blood where he had bitten his lip during the climb. Then he dragged himself to his knees and looked down into the well. Water, clear, cold water, already risen halfway up the shaft and still climbing. He could hear it flowing strong now, the musical sound of an underground spring finally freed to do what it was meant to do. Jacob laughed, a raw, exhausted sound that turned into something close to a sob. It was such a small victory, really, one day's work, but it felt like something more. It felt like proof that this broken place could be fixed. That life could return to land that everyone had written off as dead. He was still sitting there watching the water rise when Martha Hayes arrived in her wagon. She took one look at him, covered in mud and blood, soaking wet, grinning like a fool, and shook her head. Lord have mercy. Jacob Stone, you look like you've been wrestling with the devil himself. Just a well, ma'am, he said, still catching his breath. But it feels about the same. She climbed down from the wagon and approached the well, peering in. When she saw the water, her expression softened. Well, now that's something. I remember when John Mallister first dug this well. Must be 25 years ago now. He said it was the sweetest water in Montana. She looked at Jacob with new respect. You're serious about this, aren't you? About making this place work? Yes, ma'am. Martha pulled a small leather pouch from her wagon and handed it to him. Then you'll be needing this. It's nothing fancy, just some basic supplies. Bandages for those hands and a little extra coffee. Consider it a neighborly gesture. Inside the pouch, Jacob also found a folded piece of paper. When he opened it later after Martha had gone, he discovered it was the deed to his property, his own copy that he had shown Martha at the general store. Except now it had an official stamp and notation from the county clerk's office registered and recorded. The deed was more than just a piece of paper. It was proof of legitimate ownership, legal and binding. It was protection against anyone who might try to claim the land was obtained improperly. And given his conversation with Dale Hutchins that morning, Jacob suspected Martha had gone to the trouble of getting it officially registered for exactly that reason. He held the deed carefully, reading the formal legal language that declared him the rightful owner of the Mallister Ranch and all its property. At the bottom in Martha's handwriting was a note just in case someone tries to tell you different. You're the legal owner, clear and proper. Don't let anyone make you doubt it. That night, Jacob sat on the porch he would need to repair, looking out over land that was finally truly his. The well was flowing. The deed was secure. He had taken the first real steps toward rebuilding. But as he sat there in the gathering darkness, he couldn't shake the memory of Dale Hutchins's parting words or the cold certainty in the man's eyes. This was just the beginning. The real fight, Jacob suspected, was still to come. He touched the deed in his pocket, feeling the texture of the paper through the fabric. Let Dale Hutchins bring whatever trouble he wanted. Jacob had been broken before, had lost everything that mattered. He knew exactly how much pain a man could survive. And he knew, too, that sometimes the only way forward was to plant your feet and refuse to be moved. No matter what storms came your way, the stars emerged one by one overhead, countless and cold and beautiful. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called. The wind moved through the broken fences with a sound like whispered promises. Jacob Stone closed his eyes and allowed himself for the first time in 6 long years to imagine a future worth fighting for. Jacob settled into a routine over the following weeks, getting up before dawn and working until the light was gone. His body, though strong, complained about the non-stop work. Muscles he had forgotten he had made themselves known with every move. But there was something healing in the tiredness, something that quieted the restless ghosts that had haunted him for years. The barn became his first big project after the well. The structure was basically sound, good wood frame, solid base, but the roof had multiple leaks, and the doors hung crooked on their hinges. He spent 3 days just clearing out years of built-up trash, rotting hay, broken tools, the abandoned nests of countless creatures that had made the barn their home. On the 4th day, while sorting through the pile of usable tools in the corner, Jacob found something that made him stop. It was a carpenter's toolbox, old but well-made, made of oak with dovetailed joints and a brass latch. The wood was dusty, but showed no signs of rot. Someone had built this box to last thought. He opened it carefully. Inside, arranged with careful care, was a complete set of carpenter's tools: saws, chisels, planes, marking gauges, all showing the marks of use, but still in good condition. Someone had kept these tools with love and respect. On the inside of the lid, burned into the wood with a hot iron with the initials J.M. John Mallister. Sarah's husband, D. Jacob, lifted out a hand plane, testing its weight and balance. It was a fine tool, better than anything he currently owned. He checked each piece in turn, noting how the blades had been kept sharp, how the wooden handles had been oiled against the dry Montana air. These were the tools of a craftsman, a man who took pride in his work. The discovery stirred something in Jacob's memory. He was 11 years old again, standing in his father's workshop in Missouri, watching those weathered hands guide a plane across a board with steady, patient strokes. His father had been a farmer, but he had also been a skilled carpenter, believing that a man should be able to build or fix anything his land required. "You see how the grain runs, Jacob?" his father had said, rough fingers tracing the wood. "You work with it, not against it. The tree already knows what it wants to be. Your job is just to help it along." Jacob had spent 2 years learning his father's craft before tuberculosis took the old man. Those skills had served Jacob well over the decades, even if he had nearly forgotten them in recent years of drifting and despair. Now holding John Mallister's tools, Jacob felt a connection across time to another man who had worked this land, who had poured his skill and sweat into making something lasting. It seemed almost like an invitation, a passing of responsibility from one caretaker of this place to another. He spent the rest of that day working on the barn doors, using Mallister's tools to straighten the frames and rehang them properly. The work went slowly at first, as his hands remembered skills they had not practiced in years, but gradually the old knowledge returned. The rhythm of the plane, the precise angle of the chisel, the way to read the grain of the wood. It all came back like a half-forgotten song by evening. Both barn doors hung straight and closed properly. It was a small thing, but it filled Jacob with a satisfaction he had not felt in years. He cleaned each tool carefully before returning it to the box, just as his father had taught him, just as John Mallister surely had done. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jacob was mixing mortar to repair the stone foundation of the house when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find a young man, perhaps 20 years old, standing at the edge of the property. The boy was thin to the point of skinny, his clothes worn and dusty from travel, his face shadowed with tiredness and something that looked like fear. "Help you?" Jacob asked, straightening slowly. "Dot." The young man swallowed hard before speaking. "Looking for work, sir? Any kind of work?" I'm strong and I learn quick and I don't eat much. The words came out in a rush, desperate and rehearsed. Jacob studied him. The boy had good eyes, direct, honest, but they held the weariness of someone who had known too much hardship too young. His hands, though young, showed calluses. He knew labor. What's your name? Ben, sir. Ben Cooper. Where are you from, Ben? The boy hesitated, and Jacob saw the struggle play out across his face. The urge to lie fighting with the need to tell truth. Finally, he said, came from Wyoming territory. Had some trouble there. Nothing criminal, he added quickly. Just family trouble. Figured it was better to move on. Jacob recognized that particular kind of trouble. He had seen it before in young men who came from homes where love was scarce and violence plentiful. Boys who ran not because they were cowards, but because staying meant becoming something they did not want to be. I can't pay much, Jacob said. Finally, $1 a day, meals, and a place to sleep in the barn once I get it fixed up proper. Works hard and the hours are long. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know if this place will make it. Could be. We'll both be looking for work come winter. Ben's face changed with relief and something like hope. I don't need much, sir. Just a chance. All right, then. But I've got rules. You work hard. You tell the truth, and you don't bring trouble to my door. We have a problem. We talk it through like men. That agreeable? Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Jacob nodded toward the barn. There's a cleared space in the back corner. You can throw your bedroll there for now. Get yourself settled, then come back and I'll show you what needs doing. Ben practically ran to the barn, and Jacob returned to his mortar mixing, wondering if he had just made a wise decision or a foolish one. He did not have money to spare for hired help, but he also knew that some debts could not be measured in dollars like the debt he owed to all the people who had given him chances when he had nothing to offer but his word and his willingness to work. When Ben returned, Jacob handed him a shovel and set him to work clearing the drainage ditches around the foundation. The boy attacked the task with fierce energy, as if afraid that any pause might give Jacob time to reconsider. Jacob watched him work for a few minutes, noting the efficient movements, the way Ben paced himself for endurance rather than speed. The boy had done manual labor before asterisk. They worked in friendly silence until midday when Jacob called a halt for the noon meal. He had little to offer bread, cheese, and water from the well, but Ben ate like it was a feast. Jacob found himself sharing more food than he had planned, remembering too well what it felt like to be young and hungry and alone. You know anything about carpentry? Jacob asked as they ate. A little, sir. My grandfather was a furniture maker back in Pennsylvania. He taught me some before he passed. Good. That'll be useful. Jacob pointed toward the house. Most of this place needs rebuilding. Carpentry, masonry, roofing, everything. You willing to learn as we go? Yes, sir. Whatever you need. Over the following days, Jacob discovered that Ben was as good as his word. The boy worked from dawn to dusk without complaint, following instructions carefully and asking thoughtful questions. He was quick to learn and seemed to have a natural aptitude for building work. More than that, he was grateful in a way that made Jacob's chest tight, grateful for work, for food, for simple human kindness. In the evenings. After the day's work was done, they would sit outside the barn, and Jacob would explain the next day's tasks, showing Ben how to read the land and the structures, teaching him the skills his own father had taught him. Sometimes Ben would ask questions about Jacob's past, but he did so carefully, respectfully, and Jacob found himself offering small pieces of his history in return. I had a ranch once, Jacob said, one evening watching the sun set over the mountains down in Colorado territory. Built it up from nothing with my wife Elizabeth. Thought we had the world figured out. Then waited, sensing there was more. Then the drought came. 3 years with barely enough rain to keep the dust settled. Lost most of the herd. Had to borrow money to keep going. And when the rain still didn't come, we lost it all. Jacob paused. The old pain still sharp even after all these years. Elizabeth got sick that last winter. Fever took her in 4 days. I was so busy trying to save the ranch. I didn't even realize how bad off she was until it was too late. I'm sorry, sir, Ben said quietly. Jacob nodded. After that, I just drifted. Worked other men's ranches, saved my wages, tried to figure out what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. Then I saw the notice about this place in the Helena newspaper, and something about it just spoke to me. Felt like maybe I was being given one more chance to do it right. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the Montana prairie. Finally, Ben spoke. My pa drank. When he drank, he got mean. Ma left when I was 12. Just walked out one morning and never came back. Can't say I blamed her, but had left me and my little sister alone with him. He drew a shaky breath. Last month, he came at Sarah with a belt. I stopped him, put him down hard. He told me if he ever saw me again, he'd kill me. Your sister's staying with our aunt in Cheyenne. She's safe. Ben looked at Jacob, his young face earnest in the fading light. I'm not running because I'm scared, Mr. Stone. I'm running because if I stayed, I'd have ended up killing him. And I don't want to be that man. Jacob understood. Sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was walk away from a fight, especially when winning that fight would cost him his soul. You did right, Ben. Took more courage to leave than to stay and let it turn you into something you're not. The boy's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if some burden he had been carrying had lightened just a fraction. They sat together in the gathering darkness. Two men who had lost everything and were trying to build something new from the ruins. Over the next week, they made big progress. The barn roof was patched and weatherproofed. The foundation drainage was cleared. They repaired and reinforced the corral fences. Working with wood, Jacob salvaged from the collapsed sections and new timber. He bought on credit from Martha's store dot. But on the 8th day after Ben's arrival, Jacob discovered the first sign of real trouble. He was checking the fence line along the eastern boundary, the side closest to Dale Hutchins's property, when he found that 3 fence posts had been moved during the night. Not removed, but repositioned about 10 feet onto Jacob's land with new wires strung between them. It was a subtle thing, the kind of change that might go unnoticed for weeks or months. But it effectively claimed a strip of Jacob's property for Hutchins's use, and if left unchallenged, could become the basis for a legal boundary dispute later. Jacob stood looking at the moved posts, feeling a cold anger settle in his gut. This was how it started. Small provocations. Testing to see if he would notice, if he would respond, if he could be pushed off his land through 1,000 minor incursions. He called Ben over and showed him the moved posts. This is Hutchins's work. He's testing us, seeing if we're paying attention. What do we do? Ben asked, and Jacob could see the boy's hands curling into fists. We put the fence back where it belongs. We document it and we make sure he knows we're not asleep. Jacob pulled out the survey map that had come with his deed, checking the property markers. Then we ride the fence line every 3 days. If he wants to play games, we'll make it clear we know every inch of what's ours. They spent the rest of the day moving the posts back to their proper locations, setting them deep and solid. Jacob marked each post with a distinctive notch that would make any future tampering obvious. It was tedious work but necessary as they worked. Jacob taught Ben about boundary disputes, about the importance of documentation, about how men like Hutchins use legal technicalities and gradual encroachment to steal what they wanted. The boy listened intently, understanding that this was as much a part of ranching as mending fences or feeding cattle. That night, Jacob updated the journal he had begun keeping, recording the fence tampering with precise details and measurements. He had learned the hard way that memory was not enough in legal disputes. You needed records, documentation, proof. Ben watched him write by lamplight, then asked, "You think he'll try worse than this?" "Maybe," Jacob said. "Men like Hutchins don't like to lose. He'll push until he finds our breaking point or until he realizes we don't have one." He looked up at the boy. "You signed on for ranch work." Ben didn't sign on for a fight. "If you want to move on, find easier employment." "I'll understand." Ben shook his head firmly. "I'm staying, Mr. Stone. You gave me a chance when nobody else would. I'm not the kind to walk away from that." Jacob felt something warm settle in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. It felt like family, like belonging, like home. "All right, then," he said quietly. "We see this through together." Outside, the wind whispered through the repaired barn, and the water flowed sweet and clear from the restored well. The ranch was beginning to breathe again, beginning to live. And Jacob Stone, for the first time since losing Elizabeth, felt like perhaps he was beginning to live again too. Spring arrived for real, bringing longer days and warmer temperatures. The land began to change under Jacob's steady care. What had been fields of weeds were now cleared and ready. The rich soil turned and ready for planting. The house no longer looked like it might collapse at any moment. The porch was reinforced, the worst holes in the roof patched, windows fixed or replaced. But Jacob knew that without seed and livestock, all his work would amount to nothing. The ranch needed to produce to make money, or it would fail just as surely as the Malister's dream had failed, and his savings were running dangerously low. He was in the barn taking stock of his remaining money and trying to calculate how far they might stretch. When he heard the sound of a wagon approaching through the open door, he saw Martha Hayes driving up the path, her sturdy mare pulling a loaded wagon. Jacob walked out to meet her, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Mrs. Hayes, this is a surprise." Martha climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease, though Jacob noticed she moved a bit more stiffly than she had a month ago. The woman worked hard, probably too hard for her age. She gestured toward the wagon bed. "Brought you something, Jacob Stone. Figure you're about ready to start planting, and a man can't farm without seed." Jacob looked into the wagon and felt his throat tighten. There were bags of seed corn, enough to plant several acres. Beside them were smaller bags of vegetable seeds, beans, squash, potatoes. It was a fortune in seed, more than he could possibly afford right now. "Mrs. Hayes, I appreciate this, but I don't have the money to—" "Did I ask for money?" Martha interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "This is a loan, Jacob. No interest, no payment due until after harvest. If the crop fails, we'll talk about it then. But something tells me you're not the type to let a crop fail. Why are you doing this?" Jacob asked quietly. Martha was silent for a moment, looking out over the changed ranch. When she spoke, her voice was softer, touched with old grief. "My husband Thomas died 12 years ago. Heart gave out while he was plowing the north field. We never had children, so when he passed, I had a choice. Sell out and move back east where I had family, or stay and run the store myself." She turned to face Jacob, and he saw the strength in her weathered face. "Everyone told me to sell. Said a woman my age had no business trying to manage alone. But Thomas and I had built something here together, and I wasn't ready to let it go. So I stayed." She smiled slightly. "People thought I was foolish then, too. But here I am, still standing, still running the store, still proving them wrong." "I understand," Jacob said. And he did. "I think you do," Martha agreed. "Thomas used to say that the measure of a community isn't in its richest citizens, but in how it treats the folks who are trying to build something from nothing. He believed in giving people chances." She patted the side of the wagon. "So, this is me giving you a chance. Same way folks gave me and Thomas a chance when we first came to Montana." Jacob felt the weight of her trust settle on his shoulders. Heavy but welcome. "I won't let you down, Mrs. Hayes. I know you won't. Now, you going to help me unload these bags? Or are we going to stand here talking all day?" Jacob called Ben over, and together they unloaded the precious seed, storing it carefully in the barn where it would stay dry. Martha refused their offer of coffee, saying she needed to get back to the store. But as she climbed back onto her wagon, she pulled out one more small bag. "Almost forgot. This is a gift, not a loan." She handed the bag to Jacob. It was full of seed potatoes, already sprouting eyes. These were Thomas's pride and joy. He developed this variety himself over 10 years, selecting the best producers each season. They're hardy, disease-resistant, and they store well through winter. "I've been saving them, but I don't have the land to plant them proper anymore. Seems right that they should go to someone who'll appreciate them." Jacob accepted the bag reverently, understanding the gift for what it was, a piece of Martha's heart, a connection to the husband she still mourned. "I'll take good care of them, ma'am. And when harvest comes, I'll save seed for you." "You're a good man." "Jacob Stone," Martha said simply, and drove away. For the next 2 weeks, Jacob and Ben worked dawn to dusk, preparing and planting the fields. They marked straight rows with string and stakes, planted the corn in the traditional way, 4 seeds to a hill, spaced for the Montana growing season. The vegetable garden went in near the house where Jacob could water it easily from the well. Martha's special potatoes got their own section planted with extra care. The physical labor was exhausting, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. This was the work Jacob had been born to do, putting seed in the earth, trusting in the cycle of seasons, participating in the ancient human enterprise of making things grow. Ben took to the work naturally, his young back and strong arms making quick work of tasks that would have taken Jacob twice as long alone. In the evenings, after the day's planting was done, Jacob began teaching Ben to read. He had noticed that the boy struggled with the written instructions on seed packets, and when he gently inquired, Ben had admitted with shame that he had only 2 years of schooling before his mother left, and his father needed him working full-time. Nothing shameful in not knowing. Jacob told him, "Shame only comes from refusing to learn when you have the chance." They used Sarah Mellister's journal as their textbook, Ben slowly sounding out words by lamplight, while Jacob corrected pronunciation and explained meaning. The boy was hungry for knowledge, staying up late to practice his letters. Determined to master this skill the way he mastered every physical task, Jacob set him. One evening, as Ben struggled through a passage about the McAllisters' first successful wheat harvest, he paused and looked up at Jacob. "Mr. Stone, why do you think they failed? The McAllisters? I mean, they seemed like they were good people, hard workers. What happened?" Jacob considered the question carefully. "I think sometimes good people and hard work aren't enough. The drought wasn't their fault. Their son's death wasn't their fault. John's illness wasn't their fault. Sometimes the world just breaks your heart, and you don't have anything left to fight with. But you're fighting," Ben pointed out. "You lost just as much, maybe more. What makes you different?" It was a fair question, one Jacob had asked himself many times. "I think," he paused, searching for the right words, "I think maybe I'm too stubborn to know when I'm beaten, or maybe I'm just too tired of running. This place, this land, it feels like my last stand. If I can't make it work here, then I don't deserve to make it work anywhere." Ben absorbed this silently, then returned to his reading. But Jacob could see the boy thinking, processing, forming his own understanding of perseverance and second chances. The days grew warmer, and the first green shoots began appearing in the fields. Tiny promises of corn plants pushing through the soil. Jacob checked them every morning, feeling an absurd surge of pride at each new sprout. The garden plants were flourishing too, the vegetables thriving in the rich soil and regular watering. But their progress did not go unnoticed. Jacob began seeing riders from the Double H Ranch passing by more frequently, always at a distance, always watching. Once he found tracks near the creek that suggested someone had been scouting his water sources. Another time he discovered that someone had opened the corral gate during the night. Fortunately, they had not yet acquired any horses or cattle to wander off. These incidents were never quite serious enough to justify confrontation, never quite innocent enough to ignore. Jacob documented each one in his journal, noting dates and details, building a record of systematic harassment. Sheriff Brennan stopped by one afternoon and confirmed Jacob's suspicions. "Dale's been asking questions around town. Wants to know about your finances, whether you're meeting your obligations to suppliers. If anyone thinks you're going to make it through the season, what are people telling him?" Jacob asked. Brennan smiled slightly. "Most folks are telling him to mind his own business. You've got more friends in Copper Ridge than you might think, Jacob. People respect what you're doing here." His expression turned more serious. "But Dale's got resources you don't. Be careful." "Always am, Sheriff." After Brennan left, Jacob stood looking out over his growing fields. Feeling the weight of all that depended on the next few months. The seed had to germinate and grow. The weather had to cooperate. He had to stay healthy enough to bring in the harvest. And he had to keep Dale Hutchins from finding some way to sabotage everything he was building. It was a lot for one man and one boy to manage. But as Jacob watched Ben working in the garden, carefully tending the young plants with the same dedication he brought to every task, Jacob felt something he had not felt in years' hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of his first days here, but something stronger and deeper. The hope that comes from seeing your efforts bear fruit. From knowing you are not alone, from believing that maybe, just maybe, the future might be better than the past. That evening, as they sat outside watching the stars emerge, Ben spoke quietly. "Mr. Stone, I want you to know something. Whatever happens with Hutchins, whatever trouble comes, I'm with you. You're the first person who's treated me like I was worth something since my grandfather died. That means more to me than I can say." Jacob felt his eyes sting and had to clear his throat before responding. "You're worth plenty, Ben. Don't ever let anyone tell you different. You've got a good heart and a strong back, and you're learning fast. Any man would be proud to have you working beside him." They sat in companionable silence as the night deepened around them. Two men bound together by circumstance and choice, by shared labor and mutual respect. The fields rustled softly in the evening breeze. And somewhere in the distance, a creek flowed over stones, singing its endless song. The Mallister Ranch was coming back to life, one seed, one board, one day at a time. And Jacob Stone, who had come here expecting nothing but hard work and solitude, found himself part of something larger. A small community built on trust and second chances, growing as surely as the corn in his fields. Dot summer arrived with full force, bringing long days of intense heat and the constant demands of a working ranch. The corn was now knee-high, the stalks strong and green, swaying in the prairie wind like rows of soldiers standing at attention. The garden overflowed with vegetables, providing fresh food that supplemented their basic supplies and made their meals feel almost luxurious after months of dried goods and preserved meat. Jacob decided it was time to acquire livestock. A ranch without animals was just land, and he needed the ranch to start producing income. With his remaining savings and a loan against the expected harvest from the general store, he bought 3 cows, a young bull, and a dozen chickens from a farmer in the next valley who was selling out to move to Oregon. The day they brought the animals home, Ben was as excited as a child at Christmas, helping Jacob settle the cattle in the reinforced corral and building a proper chicken coop from salvaged lumber. The hens began laying within days, providing eggs that made their breakfast feel substantial and real. But more significant than the livestock was what Jacob found one afternoon while organizing the barn for proper animal housing. Tucked behind a support beam wrapped in oiled canvas was the Mallister brand iron. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a beautifully crafted piece of metalwork, a stylized M enclosed in a circle. A kind of brand that would mark an animal clearly without causing excessive damage to the hide. Jacob stood in the dusty barn, holding the iron and feeling the weight of history in his hands. He could create his own brand, stamp this land with his own identity. That would be the practical choice, the forward-looking choice. But as he thought about Sarah Meister's journal, about John's careful carpentry tools, about the love and labor this family had poured into the land before heartbreak drove them away, he knew what he had to do. He would keep the Mallister brand alive. He would honor their memory by making their ranch flourish again. It felt right in a way that logic could not quite explain, a connection across time, a promise to the dead that their work would not be forgotten. When he told Ben about his decision, the young man nodded seriously. "That's good, Mr. Stone. Shows respect. Shows you're building on what came before, not just taking it over." They spent the next day preparing to brand the cattle. Jacob built a fire and heated the iron until it glowed red. Then they worked together to safely restrain each animal and apply the mark. The cattle protested, as cattle do, but the process was quick and the brand was clean. When they released the last cow, Jacob stood back and looked at his small herd, each one now bearing the Mallister Circle M. "There," he said quietly. "Now it's official. This is Mallister land again." Word of Jacob's decision reached town quickly, as news always did in small communities. Martha Hayes heard about it at the store, and according to Sheriff Brennan, who stopped by the following week, she had cried when someone told her. "Not from sadness," the sheriff explained, "but from being moved that someone cared enough to honor the memory of her friends." "Martha asked me to tell you something," Brennan said, sitting on the newly repaired porch with a cup of Jacob's coffee. "She said Thomas would have liked you said you're the kind of neighbor this valley needs." The praise made Jacob uncomfortable in the way genuine compliments always did, so he simply nodded and changed the subject. But later, alone with his thoughts, he allowed himself to feel proud of the choice he had made. The positive news did not last long. 3 days after branding the cattle, Jacob went out to check on them and found one of his cows dead in the corral. At first he thought it might be disease or accident, but a closer examination revealed the truth. Someone had poisoned the water trough. There were traces of some toxic substance in the water, and the cow had drunk deeply. Before the poison took effect, Jacob stood over the dead animal, feeling rage and grief war inside him. The cow represented a significant portion of his investment, money he could not afford to lose. But more than that, it represented someone's willingness to kill an innocent animal just to hurt him. It was a level of cruelty that went beyond business rivalry into something darker. Ben found him there and immediately understood what had happened. The boy's face went red with anger. "Hutchkins. It had to be Hutchkins. We should ride over there right now and what?" Jacob interrupted, his voice sharp. "Accuse a wealthy, influential man of poisoning our cow with no proof beyond our suspicions. That's what he wants, Ben. He wants us to lose our tempers. Do something rash that makes us look like the troublemakers. So, we just let him get away with it." Ben's voice was thick with frustration. "No, we document it. We clean the trough thoroughly and watch the herd carefully. We make sure all the other animals are all right, and we stay smart." Jacob looked at the younger man, seeing the barely controlled fury in his eyes. "I know it's hard. I want to ride over there and settle this too. but that would be giving him exactly what he wants. A reason to call the sheriff, to make us look violent and unstable. Ben took several deep breaths, visibly trying to master his emotions. Finally, he nodded. All right, we do it your way, but I don't like it. Neither do I, son. Neither do I. They buried the cow and spent the rest of the day scrubbing the water trough and checking every inch of the corral for other signs of sabotage. Jacob also began the practice of testing the water himself before letting the animals drink, a time-consuming precaution that added to their daily workload. That evening, Sheriff Brennan appeared at the ranch without being summoned. He dismounted slowly and walked over to where Jacob and Ben sat outside the barn. "Heard you lost a cow," Brennan said without preamble. "Word travels fast," Jacob replied neutrally. "It does when Dale Hutchkins is at the saloon buying drinks and mentioning how some folks just don't have the skill to keep livestock alive." Brennan's jaw was tight. "Thought you should know what he's saying." Jacob nodded slowly. So Hutchkins was not even hiding his involvement, just being careful not to admit anything directly. "Appreciate you telling me, Sheriff." Brennan sat down on a crate, looking tired. "I've been sheriff here for 12 years, Jacob. I know Dale. I know how he operates. He'll push and push until you either break or push back. And when you push back, he'll use the law against you however he can. So what do you suggest?" "Keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. Stay calm. Don't give him ammunition." Brennan paused, then added, "And know that there are people watching. Not everyone in this valley is under Dale's thumb. Some of us remember what it means to give a man a fair shake." After the sheriff left, Jacob pulled out his journal and made a detailed entry about the poisoned cow, the date, the symptoms, the condition of the water, everything he could remember. If this ever went to court, he would need evidence. He would need records. But as he wrote, a small part of him wondered how long he could maintain this level of vigilance, this constant defensive posture. He was one man trying to build a ranch while simultaneously defending it from someone with unlimited resources and no scruples about using them. How long before exhaustion made him careless? How long before Hutchkins found a weakness he could exploit? The next morning brought an unexpected visitor, a traveling preacher who stopped at the ranch while making his circuit through the valley. Reverend Matthews was a rail-thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He asked permission to water his horse at the well and inquired if Jacob and Ben would be interested in a brief worship service. Jacob declined politely. "Appreciate the offer, Reverend, but I'm not much for organized religion these days." Matthews nodded without judgment. "That's your right, certainly. But if you don't mind my asking, was there a time when you or Jacob found himself answering honestly? When I was young, yes, my parents were believers. Raised me to have faith, but after I lost everything, my ranch, my wife, I found it hard to believe in a God who would let good people suffer so much for no reason." "That's a hard question," Matthews acknowledged. "Perhaps the hardest one we face. I won't pretend to have easy answers for you." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "But I will say this. Sometimes faith isn't about understanding why bad things happen. Sometimes it's just about believing you have the strength to endure them, and that endurance itself is a kind of grace." The words settled into Jacob's chest, finding a home in a place he had thought was closed off. He did not respond, but he nodded his thanks for the thought before Matthews left. He mentioned that he would be holding a service in Copper Ridge the following Sunday, and anyone who wished to attend would be welcome. Then he rode away, leaving Jacob with uncomfortable thoughts about faith and purpose, and whether he had been running from more than just his past. That night, Ben asked a question that had clearly been troubling him. "Mr. Stone, do you ever wish you could just give up? Sell to Hutchkins, take the money, and go somewhere easier?" Jacob considered lying, offering some noble answer about perseverance and duty. But Ben deserved honesty. "Yes," he said simply. "Some mornings I wake up and wonder if I'm just being stubborn for the sake of being stubborn. Wonder if it wouldn't be smarter to cut my losses and move on. So why don't you?" Because Jacob said slowly, "I think maybe there are some things worth being stubborn about. This land, what it represents. The chance to build something lasting to prove that failure isn't final. That feels worth fighting for, even when the fighting gets hard." Ben nodded, absorbing this. "I'm glad you're stubborn then, because this is the first place that's ever felt like home to me." Those words stayed with Jacob long after they had both turned in for the night. Home. Such a simple word, but laden with so much meaning. This ranch was becoming home, not just for him, but for Ben too. And maybe, just maybe, it could become home for others as well. People who needed a second chance, a place to belong, a reason to believe their best days were not behind them. The thought both terrified and inspired him. Because if this place could mean that much, then he had to protect it. No matter what Dale Hutchins threw at him, no matter how exhausted he became, he had to find a way to make the ranch survive. Not just for himself, but for everyone who believed in what he was building. The heat of high summer bore down on the ranch with relentless intensity. The corn stood tall now, tassels forming at the top of each stalk, promising a good harvest if the weather held. The garden continued to produce abundantly, and Jacob found himself trading excess vegetables in town for other supplies, building relationships and goodwill with his neighbors. The remaining cattle were thriving despite the earlier loss, and the chickens had multiplied. Several hens had gone broody and hatched chicks that now scurried around the coop under their mother's watchful eyes. The ranch was beginning to feel like a living, breathing enterprise rather than just a collection of repaired buildings and cleared fields. But the progress came at a cost. Jacob's body, strong as it was, felt the accumulated toll of months of relentless labor. His joints ached in the mornings, and old injuries from his younger days made themselves known with increasing frequency. He was 57 years old, and some days he felt every year of it. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of fence repair, Jacob sat on the porch steps trying to ease the pain in his lower back. Ben noticed and brought him a cup of willow bark tea, something Martha had taught the boy to make for inflammation. "You ought to rest more, Mr. Stone," Ben said with concern. "You're working yourself into the ground." "Rest is a luxury we can't afford yet," Jacob replied, though he accepted the tea gratefully. "Too much still needs doing before winter comes." Ben sat beside him, quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Mr. Stone, can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead." "You've told me about losing your ranch and your wife, but you hadn't really talked about her, about Elizabeth. What was she like?" The question caught Jacob off guard. He had become so practiced at avoiding thoughts of Elizabeth that he barely allowed himself to remember anymore. But Ben's earnest face, the genuine interest in his eyes, made Jacob want to answer honestly. "She was," he paused, searching for words. "She was the best person I ever knew. Patient and kind, but strong too. Stronger than me in a lot of ways." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the silver pocket watch he always carried. This was hers, actually. Her father gave it to her when she turned 18. She carried it every day. He opened the watch, revealing the inscription inside. "To Elizabeth, may your time be filled with joy." Ben leaned closer to see. "It stopped the day she died," Jacob said quietly. "February 14th, 1879, 3 in the afternoon. I've carried it with me ever since, but I've never wound it again. Couldn't bring myself to do it. Felt like starting it again would be, I don't know, like erasing her somehow. Like moving on meant forgetting." "But you haven't forgotten her," Ben observed gently. "No, I haven't." Jacob ran his thumb over the smooth silver case. "We met at a church social in Colorado. I was 23, working as a ranch hand, saving money to buy my own place someday. She was the daughter of the ranch owner I worked for. Everyone said she was too good for me, and they were probably right, but she saw something in me anyway." He fell silent, lost in memory. Ben waited patiently, sensing there was more. "We built that ranch together," Jacob continued. "Every fence post, every building, every decision. We did it as partners. She could ride better than most men, could shoot straight, could deliver a calf or mend a roof or keep the books. She was everything a rancher could hope for in a wife." "What happened? How did she get sick?" Jacob's voice grew rough. "The drought hit us hard. We were struggling, and I was so focused on trying to save the ranch that I didn't notice how exhausted she was getting. She never complained, just kept working as hard as I was. Then one day, she collapsed while hanging laundry. By the time I got her to town, the fever was already raging. Doctor said it was pneumonia. Said if we had caught it earlier, maybe." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "But we didn't catch it earlier. And 4 days later, she was gone. I was so busy trying to save a piece of land that I let the person I loved most in the world work herself to death. The old guilt was as sharp as ever, cutting through the years like it had happened yesterday." "That wasn't your fault, Mr. Stone," Ben said firmly. "Wasn't it? I was her husband. I was supposed to protect her to notice when she needed help. Instead, I was so caught up in my own pride and refusing to admit defeat that I lost sight of what really mattered." Jacob closed the watch and returned it to his pocket. "That's why I left Colorado. Couldn't bear to stay in a place where everything reminded me of her, of my failure." They sat in silence for a while, the evening air cooling around them. Finally, Ben spoke again. My grandfather used to say that sometimes the kindest thing we can do for the people we've lost is to keep living, to not let their deaths stop us from becoming who we're meant to be. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man. He was. I think he'd tell you that Elizabeth wouldn't want you to carry that watch like a punishment. She'd want you to wind it again to let time move forward, even though she can't come with you. The words hit Jacob with unexpected force. He wanted to argue, to defend his grief, to cling to the familiar pain because at least it kept Elizabeth close. But something in what Ben said rang true. Elizabeth had loved life, had faced every challenge with optimism and grace. She would not have wanted him to spend the rest of his days frozen in the moment of her death. But he was not ready, not yet. Maybe someday, he said quietly. But not today. Ben nodded, accepting this. They sat together, watching the stars emerge, the sound of crickets filling the warm night air. After a while, Ben stood to head to the barn, but he paused at the bottom of the steps. Mr. Stone, thank you for telling me about her. It helps me understand you better. I think maybe you're not giving yourself enough credit. You're trying to honor her memory by not giving up, by building something good here. That counts for something. After Ben had gone, Jacob sat alone on the porch, turning the boy's words over in his mind. Was that what he was doing? Trying to honor Elizabeth by succeeding where he had failed before, or was he just running from one form of pain into another? He pulled out the watch again, holding it in the lamplight. The hands showed 3, forever locked in that terrible afternoon. For 6 years, he had kept time itself prisoner, unable to let go of the moment he lost everything. But Ben was right. Elizabeth would not have wanted this. She would have wanted him to live fully, to embrace whatever time he had left, to find joy and purpose and connection. She would have wanted him to wind the watch, to let the hours tick forward into an unknown future. His hand moved toward the winding stem, then stopped. He could not do it. Not yet. The grief was still too raw, the guilt too heavy. Maybe someday he would be ready to let time flow again. But that day had not yet come. He returned the watch to his pocket and went inside to sleep. Dodd the following week brought another test. Jacob was in town picking up supplies from Martha's store when he encountered Dale Hutchins on the street. The wealthy rancher was surrounded by several of his men, clearly in town on business. When Dale spotted Jacob, his expression shifted into something between amusement and contempt. Mr. Stone, Dale said loudly enough for passers-by to hear, I heard about your unfortunate loss. Terrible thing when a man doesn't know how to properly care for his livestock. Jacob kept his expression neutral, refusing to rise to the bait. Accidents happen, Mr. Hutchins. Indeed they do, especially to inexperienced ranchers. Dale smiled coldly. I also heard you've decided to keep using the Mallister brand. That's quite presumptuous, don't you think? Taking someone else's name for your own. I'm honoring their memory, Jacob replied evenly. Seemed the respectful thing to do. Respectful, Dale repeated as if tasting the word. Or perhaps just recognizing that your own name carries no weight in this valley. Better to hide behind the reputation of people who are gone and can't object. Several town people had stopped to listen, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, but willing to listen. Jacob could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see how he would respond to the provocation. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. The Mallisters built something good on that land. They poured their hearts into it. Just because circumstances forced them to leave doesn't mean their work should be forgotten. I'm building on their foundation, trying to make their dreams succeed where they couldn't. If that bothers you, Mr. Hutchins, I'm sorry, but my decision stands. Dale's face darkened. You're a fool, Stone. That land has been cursed since the day John Mallister died. Nothing good will ever come from it. You'll fail just like they did. And when you do, I'll be there to pick up the pieces for a fraction of what I offered you. Now maybe I will fail, Jacob acknowledged. But at least I'll fail trying to build something rather than succeeding at tearing someone else down. The words hung in the air between them, and Jacob saw Dale's hands curl into fists. For a moment, he thought the rancher might actually strike him, but then Dale seemed to remember where he was, who was watching. He forced his hands to relax and his expression to smooth into a cold smile. We'll see, Mr. Stone. We'll see who's still standing when winter comes. Dale turned and strode away, his men following. Jacob stood in the street, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from his system. He had maintained his composure, had not given Dale the satisfaction of losing his temper. But he had also made an enemy more determined than ever to see him fail. Martha appeared at his elbow, having witnessed the entire exchange. "That man," she said quietly, "is going to be trouble." "I know," Jacob replied, "but you stood up to him. That matters. People saw." She squeezed his arm gently. "You're not alone in this, Jacob. Remember that." As Jacob loaded his supplies and headed back to the ranch, he thought about Martha's words. He was not alone. He had Ben, he had Martha. He had Sheriff Brennan and other town people who had shown him kindness. He had allies, even if they could not openly challenge Dale's power and influence. But he also knew that the conflict was escalating. Dale was no longer content with subtle sabotage. The public confrontation suggested that the wealthy rancher was preparing for a more direct campaign to drive Jacob off the land. And when that campaign came, Jacob would need to be ready. That evening, he and Ben sat down to review their situation honestly. They listed their assets, the improved buildings, the growing crops, the small herd, the goodwill they had built in town. Then they listed their vulnerabilities, limited cash, dependence on a successful harvest, Jacob's age, and occasional health issues, their isolation on the ranch. "We need help," Jacob concluded. "One or two more hands, people we can trust, especially for harvest time and through the winter." "Can we afford that?" Ben asked. "Can we afford not to? If something happens to me, you can't run this place alone. And if Hutchkins escalates his harassment, we need witnesses. People who can testify to what's really happening here." It was a sobering conversation, but necessary. They were no longer just building a ranch. They were preparing for a siege, a long-term struggle against an enemy with far greater resources. Their only advantages were determination, integrity, and the support of a few good people. It would have to be enough. August arrived with the promise of harvest. The corn had reached full height, the ears heavy and golden beneath the protective husks. Jacob walked through the field each morning, checking for signs of disease or pest damage, and found himself feeling something he had not experienced in years: genuine optimism about the future. If the crop came in as good as it looked, he would have enough to pay his debts, buy additional livestock, and set aside reserves for winter dawn. But that optimism was tempered by continued vigilance. The harassment from Hutchkins's direction had continued in small ways. Fences tampered with, tools mysteriously moved or damaged, occasional sightings of riders watching the property from a distance. Nothing dramatic enough to justify legal action, but enough to keep Jacob and Ben constantly on edge. It was Ben who made the discovery that would change everything. He had been reading through Sarah McAllister's journal during his evening reading practice. The pages had become his favorite text for improving his literacy when he noticed something odd. The final pages of the journal appeared thicker than normal, as if extra papers had been tucked inside the binding. "Mr. Stone," Ben called from his spot by the lamp. "There's something weird about this journal." Jacob looked up from where he was mending a bridle. "What do you mean, feel this?" Ben brought the journal over and opened it to the last pages. "There's something inside the binding." I think Jacob examined the journal carefully. Ben was right. There was a subtle bulge in the leather backing of the rear cover. He fetched a thin knife and carefully worked it into the gap between the leather and the backing board. After a few minutes of delicate work, he managed to extract several folded papers that had been hidden there, glued into the binding itself. He unfolded them with trembling fingers. The paper yellowed and brittle with age. The first was a letter written in Sarah McAllister's elegant handwriting, but in a more hurried, emotional style than her journal entries. It was dated March 1st, 1880, just 2 weeks before the final journal entry. "My dearest boys," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I'm gone, and I pray that you have found peace and prosperity wherever life has taken you. I write this in secret because I cannot bear the thought of you carrying the burden of anger and bitterness that I have struggled with these final years. You have often asked me why I never speak of your Uncle Dale, why I became so cold whenever his name was mentioned. I told you that we had grown apart, that he had chosen his own path. But that was not the complete truth, and you deserve to know it. Dale Mallister. Yes, Mallister. For that was his name before he married into the Hutchkins family and took their name to secure his inheritance, is my brother, your uncle by blood. When your father and I were struggling during the drought years when we lost our first herd and faced ruin, I went to Dale and begged him for help. Not charity, but a loan, something to tide us over until the rains returned. Dale had become wealthy by then, married to Old Man Hutchins's daughter, positioned to inherit one of the largest ranches in Montana Territory. He could have helped us easily without even noticing the expense, but he refused. He said that he had built his new life and could not risk his reputation by associating with failed farmers. He told me that our family struggles would reflect poorly on him and his new social circles. I never told your father about this conversation. It would have broken his heart to know that his own brother-in-law valued his social standing more than family. But I want you to know, so that if you ever cross paths with Dale Hutchins, you will understand what kind of man he truly is. He abandoned us, and then when your father died and we had to leave this land that we loved, Dale came sniffing around offering to buy the property at a shamefully low price. He wanted to erase any evidence of his connection to the failed Mallister Ranch to own and bury the reminder of the family he had turned his back on. I refused him. I sold to the bank instead, hoping that someday a good family would buy this land and make it prosper. My only consolation in leaving is knowing that Dale did not get what he wanted. I am not a hateful woman, and I do not wish ill on anyone. But I am human enough to hope that someday, somehow, Dale Hutchins will be forced to confront the cost of his choices. That he will understand what he lost when he traded his family for social acceptance and wealth. Remember always that this land was built with love, with the sweat and dreams of people who believed in building something lasting. Honor that, my boys. Do not let bitterness poison your hearts as it has sometimes poisoned mine. With all my love, your mother, Sarah. Jacob finished reading aloud, his voice rough with emotion. Ben sat in stunned silence, his eyes wide with shock. For a long moment, neither of them could speak. Finally, Ben whispered, "Hutchins is a Mallister. He's family, and he let them fail rather than help." Jacob carefully unfolded the second hidden document. It was an old photograph, faded and creased from being hidden so long. It showed a family portrait, a young Sarah and John Mallister with their 2 sons. Perhaps taken in the early 1870s, but standing beside Sarah, his arm around her shoulders, was a young man who was unmistakably a younger version of Dale Hutchins. The resemblance was too strong to deny. On the back of the photograph, in Sarah's handwriting, family portrait, summer 1872, John, myself, our boys Thomas and James, and my dear brother Dale before he chose ambition over blood. "That's why he wants this land so badly," Jacob said slowly, understanding dawning. "Not just for the water access or the property value. He wants to erase the evidence of his betrayal. As long as this ranch exists with the Mallister name, it's a reminder of the family he abandoned. We have to confront him with this," Ben said, his voice tight with anger. "We have to make him face what he did." "We will," Jacob agreed, "but carefully. A man with Dale's resources and guilt can be dangerous when cornered." They spent the rest of the evening discussing how to proceed. The revelation changed everything. Dale's harassment was not just business rivalry or territorial ambition. It was driven by shame and the desperate need to bury his past. That made him more unpredictable, but it also gave him a vulnerability they could exploit. The next morning, Jacob rode into town and asked Sheriff Brennan to arrange a private meeting with Dale Hutchins. The sheriff's eyebrows rose at the request, but he agreed, sensing that something significant had developed. The meeting was set for 2 days later at the sheriff's office. Jacob spent those 2 days preparing, reviewing the evidence, considering every possible response Dale might make. He brought Ben with him to the meeting, both as witness and as moral support. Dale arrived at the appointed time, flanked by his lawyer, a slick man named Garrison, who had a reputation for finding legal loopholes that favored the wealthy. Dale's expression was one of barely concealed contempt mixed with curiosity. Clearly, he could not imagine what Jacob thought he could accomplish with this meeting. "Mr. Stone," Dale said with false politeness, "I understand you requested this meeting. I'm a busy man, so perhaps you could get to the point." Jacob pulled a letter and photograph from his saddlebag and laid them on Sheriff Brennan's desk. "I found these hidden in Sarah Mallister's journal. I thought you might want to see them before I decide what to do with them." Dale glanced at the items dismissively, then froze as recognition hit him. The color drained from his face. He reached for the photograph with a shaking hand, staring at the image of his younger self, surrounded by the family he had abandoned. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Sarah hid them in her journal before she left. She wanted her sons to know the truth about their uncle, about you, if they ever needed to understand why the ranch failed." Dale's lawyer leaned over to examine the documents. These prove nothing of legal significance. Family disputes are not relevant to property rights. Maybe not, Jacob agreed, but they're relevant to reputation. I wonder what the territorial governor would think if he knew that Dale Hutchins built his fortune on the back of his sister's tragedy. Or what the people of Copper Ridge would say if they learned their wealthiest citizen refused to help his own family in their darkest hour. Dale's face had gone from white to red, his hands clenching into fists. You have no right. I have every right, Jacob interrupted, his voice calm but firm. This is part of the history of my land, my property. Sarah Mishistister's words belong to the ranch now, just like everything else she left behind. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Hutchins, perhaps we should discuss this privately before. Shut up, Garrison. Dale's voice was raw, stripped of its usual polish. He looked at Jacob with something close to desperation. What do you want, money? I'll double my original offer, triple it. Just give me those documents and walk away. I don't want your money, Jacob said quietly. I never did. I want to understand why. Why you've been trying so hard to drive me off this land. Why you couldn't just let it go. Dale was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. Because every time I ride past this place, I see them. My sister, her husband, those boys. I see the ranch they built, the dream they had, and I remember that I could have saved it. One loan, one act of family loyalty, and none of them would have had to suffer. He sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 50 years. John died of a broken heart as much as illness. Sarah aged 20 years and 5, and I did nothing. I chose my social standing, my comfortable life over my own blood. And now every day, I have to live with that choice. So you wanted to erase the evidence, Jacob said. Understanding, buy the land, tear down the buildings, make it all disappear so you wouldn't have to remember. Yes, the admission came out as barely more than a whisper. I thought if I could own it, control it, make it part of my ranch, then maybe I could bury what I did. Bury the guilt. But you? He looked up at Jacob with something like hatred mixed with grudging respect. You had to keep their name alive. Had to brand your cattle with their mark. Had to tell everyone you were honoring their memory. You made it impossible for me to forget. Sheriff Brennan, who had been silent throughout the exchange, spoke up. Dale, did you poison Jacob's cow? Did you order your men to sabotage his property? Dale's lawyer started to object, but Dale waved him off. What does it matter now? Yes, I did those things. I've been trying to make him fail. To make him so miserable he'd have to sell, because I couldn't stand the thought of the Malister name flourishing again while I had to watch. That's admission of criminal activity, Brennan said gravely. I could arrest you right now. Then do it, Dale said bitterly. At least in jail I wouldn't have to see that ranch every day. Wouldn't have to be reminded of what a coward I am. Jacob looked at the broken man in front of him and felt something unexpected, not satisfaction at Dale's confession, but pity. Dale Hutchins had spent decades building wealth and influence, but he had destroyed himself in the process. He was hollow inside, eaten away by guilt and shame that no amount of money could ease. Sheriff, Jacob said slowly, I don't want to press charges. Everyone in the room stared at him in shock. Ben started to protest, but Jacob held up a hand. Dale Hutchins has been punishing himself for years more effectively than any court could. And pressing charges would just give him what he wants, a way to publicly atone, to feel like he's paid his debt. He turned to Dale. But I'm not giving you the easy way out either. You don't get to buy the land. You don't get to make this disappear. The Malister Ranch is going to thrive, and you're going to have to watch it succeed. You're going to have to live with the knowledge that what your family built is being honored and continued by a stranger who cared more about their legacy than you did. Dale looked up at him, and for the first time, Jacob saw genuine emotion in the man's eyes. Not anger or contempt, but something like relief mixed with despair. That's a crueler punishment than anything the law could do to me. Maybe, Jacob acknowledged, but maybe it's also a chance. You can't change what you did, Dale. You can't bring back your sister or her husband or undo the years of suffering you caused. But you can choose what you do from here. You can keep trying to bury your shame, or you can find some other way to live with it. He picked up the letter and photograph, holding them carefully. These are mine now, part of the ranch's history, but I'm not going to share them publicly unless you force my hand. What people learn about your past is up to you, based on how you conduct yourself going forward. Dale's lawyer leaned over and whispered urgently to his client, but Dale ignored him. He stood slowly, looking older and more tired than Jacob had ever seen him. You're either the wisest man I've ever met or the biggest fool. I'm not sure which. Maybe both, Jacob said with a slight smile. But I've learned that sometimes the only way forward is through forgiveness, even when it's not deserved, even when it costs something. Elizabeth taught me that, even if it took me years to understand it. Dale nodded slowly, then turned and walked out of the office, his lawyer hurrying to catch up. Sheriff Brennan waited until they were gone before speaking. Jacob, are you sure about this? You had him dead to rights. Could have ended his harassment permanently. Putting him in jail wouldn't have ended anything, Jacob replied. Just would have made him more bitter, more dangerous when he got out. This way. Maybe he'll surprise us all. Ben shook his head in wonder. I don't know if you're crazy or some kind of saint, Mr. Stone, but I hope you know what you're doing. So do I, son. So do I. As they rode back to the ranch, Jacob felt something shift inside him. The confrontation with Dale had forced him to articulate something he had not fully understood until that moment. That forgiveness was not about the person being forgiven. It was about refusing to let bitterness and anger poison your own heart. It was about choosing to move forward rather than staying locked in past hurts. His hand went to his vest pocket, feeling the outline of Elizabeth's watch. Maybe Ben had been right. Maybe it was time to let time flow again, to stop holding himself prisoner to a single moment of loss and failure. But not yet. Not quite yet. That evening, as he and Ben sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jacob pulled out Sarah's letter and read it again. Her words about not letting bitterness poison your heart struck him with new force. Sarah had understood something essential, that holding on to anger and resentment hurt the person carrying it more than anyone else. What do you think will happen now? Ben asked. With Hutchins. I mean, will he honor the truce, or will this just make him worse? I honestly don't know, Jacob admitted. But I think we gave him something he's needed for a long time. The truth spoken out loud with consequences attached. What he does with that truth is up to him. The stars began to emerge overhead, countless and cold and beautiful. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called and another answered. The corn rustled in the evening breeze, heavy with the promise of harvest. Jacob felt something he had not felt in years. Not just hope for the future, but peace in the present. Whatever came next, whatever challenges the ranch still faced, he knew he had done the right thing. Not the easy thing, not the safe thing, but the right thing. And sometimes that was enough. The confrontation with Dale Hutchins changed the atmosphere at the ranch. For the first week afterward, Jacob and Ben worked with one eye always on the horizon, waiting for retaliation. But none came. The riders who had been watching the property disappeared. The small acts of sabotage ceased. It was as if Dale had simply vanished from their lives, leaving behind only an uneasy quiet. It's too quiet, Ben said one morning as they checked the cornfield. The crop was nearly ready for harvest, the ears full and heavy. Feels like the calm before a storm. Maybe, Jacob acknowledged. Or maybe Dale is actually thinking about what we said. Sometimes people surprise you. But even as he spoke the words, Jacob felt the weight of uncertainty. He had gambled on Dale's capacity for redemption, and only time would tell if that gamble would pay off. In the meantime, harvest season was approaching, and they had their own challenges to face. The corn would need to be brought in soon, a massive job for just 2 men. Jacob had put out word in town that he was looking for temporary help, offering fair wages for harvest work. Several young men from Copper Ridge had expressed interest, and Martha had suggested a few reliable hands who might be willing to work for a week or two. But then, 3 days after the meeting with Dale, something unexpected happened. Sheriff Brennan rode out to the ranch with news that stopped Jacob in his tracks. Dale's filed a lawsuit, Brennan said without preamble. Claims you're using the Mallister brand fraudulently. That as the closest living relative of Sarah Mallister, he has legal claim to the intellectual property of the ranch, including the brand. Jacob felt his stomach drop. He's suing me over the brand. His lawyer's arguing that since Dale is Sarah's brother and her sons are presumed dead or untraceable, he's the legal heir to any Mallister property, including trademarks and brands. They're requesting an injunction to prevent you from using the brand until the matter is settled in court. Ben swore colorfully, but Jacob just stood there trying to process the news. This was worse than physical sabotage. This was Dale using the law as a weapon, attacking the very heart of what the ranch represented. Without the Mallister brand, Jacob would have to rebrand all his cattle, would lose the connection to the ranch's history that had meant so much to the community. When's the hearing? Jacob asked quietly. 3 weeks. Territorial judge is making his circuit. And Dale's lawyer managed to get it on the docket fast. Brennan's expression was sympathetic, but worried. Jacob, this is serious. Dale's got expensive lawyers and a legitimate claim to being Sarah's heir. You might lose this. After Brennan left, Jacob sat on the porch steps, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had tried to be merciful, tried to give Dale a chance at redemption, and this was how the man had responded with legal warfare aimed at destroying everything Jacob had built. We should have pressed charges when we had the chance, Ben said bitterly. Should have put him in jail instead of trying to appeal to his better nature. Maybe, Jacob admitted. But we made our choice and now we live with it. Question is, what do we do next? That evening, Martha Hayes appeared at the ranch, having heard the news through the town's efficient gossip network. She brought supplies and, more importantly, advice. You need a lawyer, Jacob. And not just any lawyer. You need someone who can stand up to Garrison and his legal tricks. I can't afford that kind of lawyer, Jacob said honestly. Maybe you don't have to. Martha's eyes glinted with something like determination. There's a young lawyer in Helena named Samuel Brooks. He grew up poor, worked his way through law school, and he's got a reputation for taking on cases where the little man is getting crushed by the powerful. I'm going to write him a letter tonight. Explain your situation. Can't promise he'll take the case, but it's worth trying. Why would he help me? Because Martha said firmly, your story matters. What you're doing here, bringing this ranch back to life, honoring the memory of good people standing up to a bully, that's the kind of thing Sam Brooks cares about. He's not in it for the money. He's in it for justice. True to her word, Martha sent the letter that night. While they waited for a response, Jacob threw himself into preparing for harvest. He hired 3 local men who had worked harvest before, and together they began making plans for bringing in the crop. The work was elaborate and would require perfect timing. Corn had to be harvested when the moisture content was right. Not too wet and not too dry. But even as Jacob planned the harvest, his mind kept returning to the lawsuit. The more he thought about it, the more he understood Dale's strategy. The Brand case was just the opening move. If Dale could establish himself as the legal heir to the Mallister estate, he could potentially claim rights to the entire property. Arguing that the bank had no authority to sell what might be family land held in trust on it was brilliant and ruthless. The work of Garrison's clever legal mind finding the one vulnerability in Jacob's position, the question of inheritance and rightful ownership. 5 days later, Samuel Brooks arrived at the ranch. He was younger than Jacob expected, perhaps 35, with keen eyes and a directness that reminded Jacob of Sheriff Brennan. He had ridden out from Helena immediately upon receiving Martha's letter. Intrigued by the case, Brooks spent 3 hours reviewing every document Jacob had: the deed, the journal, the hidden letter, the photograph, Jacob's records of sabotage and harassment. He asked pointed questions, took detailed notes, and occasionally muttered to himself as he worked through the legal implications. Finally, he looked up at Jacob with a grave expression. Mr. Stone, I'm going to be honest with you. This is a difficult case. Dale Hutchkins does have a legitimate claim as Sarah Mallister's closest traceable relative. Under Montana territorial law, intellectual property like brands can be considered part of an estate, potentially inheritable. Jacob's heart sank, but Brooks held up a hand. However, there are several strong arguments we can make in your defense. First, the brand was attached to the physical property, and the bank had clear authority to sell the property with all fixtures and appurtenances, which could include the brand. Second, Dale's abandonment of his family and his name change could be argued as a voluntary relinquishment of any claim to the Mallister name and estate. Third, and most importantly, you've been using the brand in good faith, improving the property and honoring the Mallister legacy in a way Dale never did. Will that be enough? I don't know, Brooks admitted. But I'll tell you this. I've read Sarah's letter and I've seen what you've built here. This isn't just about a brand or a piece of property. It's about what it means to be a steward of someone's legacy, about earning the right to carry on someone's name through your actions rather than just your bloodline. He smiled slightly. That's the kind of case I became a lawyer to argue. So yes, Mr. Stone, I'll represent you, and we're going to fight this with everything we've got. The relief Jacob felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by worry about cost. When he tried to discuss payment, Brooks waved him off. We'll work something out after we win. And we are going to win, Mr. Stone, because the law isn't just about technicalities and bloodlines. It's also about justice and common sense. We just have to make the judge see that. Over the next 2 weeks, Jacob's life became a whirlwind of preparation on 2 fronts. By day, he worked with his hired hands to bring in the harvest. The corn coming off the stalks in great golden piles. Everything they had hoped for and more. By night, he worked with Samuel Brooks, preparing testimony, gathering supporting evidence, rehearsing answers to the questions Garrison would certainly ask Dot. Martha became an unexpected asset in the legal preparation. She dug through old records at the store, finding receipts and transaction records from the Malisters' time that established the brand as a working part of the ranch operation. She also reached out to old-timers in the valley, finding people who remembered Sarah and John, who could testify to the family's character and Dale's abandonment. Sheriff Brennan contributed as well, providing official records of Dale's harassment and Jacob's complaints, building a pattern of behavior that showed Dale's true motivations. It became clear that this was not just Jacob's fight. The community was rallying around him, seeing his struggle as something larger than one man's claim to a piece of land. But as the hearing date approached, Jacob found his thoughts turning to deeper questions. What was he really fighting for? The brand itself was just a piece of heated iron, a mark on an animal's hide. The ranch was just buildings and dirt. Why did it matter so much that he keep the Malister name alive? One evening, while reviewing documents with Brooks, Jacob asked the question out loud. Why does this mean so much to me? I could create my own brand, build my own legacy. Why am I fighting so hard to keep someone else's name? Brooks considered the question seriously before answering. I think it's because you understand something fundamental about how we're all connected. The Malisters poured their lives into this land, but circumstances beyond their control forced them to leave. You're not erasing them or replacing them. You're continuing their story, proving that their work wasn't in vain. That's a powerful thing, Mr. Stone. It says that no one is forgotten, that every person's efforts matter, that our lives can have meaning that extends beyond our own time on Earth. The words resonated deeply with Jacob, touching something he had not fully articulated even to himself. This was about more than property or pride. It was about being part of something larger than himself, about honoring the connection between past, present, and future. It was about refusing to let good work and good people be forgotten. The night before the hearing, Jacob sat alone on the porch, watching the stars wheel overhead. The harvest was in, safely stored in the repaired barn, more than enough to pay his debts and see them through winter. The ranch building stood solid and proud, no longer ruins but a working homestead. The cattle bore the Malister brand, and the land was green and productive again. He had done what he set out to do. He had brought the ranch back to life. Whether or not he kept the Malister name, that accomplishment was real and could not be taken away. But he wanted to keep the name, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him. Because keeping it meant that Sarah and John's dream lived on, that their suffering and loss had not been the end of the story. It meant that redemption was possible, that broken things could be mended, that the past could inform and enrich the future rather than simply haunting it. Jacob reached into his vest pocket and pulled out Elizabeth's watch. He held it in the moonlight, looking at the hands frozen at 3 a.m. For 6 years, he had kept this watch stopped, unable to let time move forward past the moment of his greatest loss. But now, sitting on the porch of a ranch he had restored, surrounded by evidence of his own capacity for renewal, he understood something new. Dot time was going to move forward, whether he was ready or not. The question was whether he would move with it or remain forever locked in the past. Elizabeth was gone and nothing could change that. But he was still here, still alive, still capable of building and creating and loving. Keeping the watch stopped did not honor her memory. It dishonored her life by suggesting that nothing good could come after her death. With shaking fingers, Jacob found the winding stem and began to turn it. Click by click, the mechanism tightened. Then he adjusted the hands to match the actual time, 10:30 in the evening. He held the watch to his ear and heard what he had not heard in 6 years. The steady, faithful tick of time passing, of life continuing, of possibilities unfolding. Tears ran down his weathered face. But they were not entirely tears of grief. They were tears of release, of letting go, of finally accepting that he deserved to live fully. Even though Elizabeth could not be with him, he could honor her memory, not by staying frozen in loss, but by embracing life with the same courage and optimism she had shown. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he whispered to the night, to her memory, to the universe. "But I think I'm finally ready to move forward. I think I'm finally ready to let myself be happy again." The watch ticked steadily in his palm, marking the passage of seconds, minutes, hours, all the time he had left to build and love and live. Tomorrow he would walk into a courtroom and fight for the right to keep the Mallister name. But tonight he had finally made peace with his own past and whatever happened in that courtroom. He knew now that he would be all right. He had survived the worst, had rebuilt from ruins, had learned to open his heart again. He was not the broken man who had ridden onto this property 6 months ago. He was stronger, wiser, more whole. He was ready for whatever came next. The territorial courthouse in Copper Ridge was packed when Jacob arrived with Samuel Brooks and Ben. Word had spread throughout the valley about the case, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to watch. Martha Hayes sat in the front row, her expression determined. Sheriff Brennan stood against the back wall, his arms crossed. Even some of the men Jacob had hired for harvest had come, their presence a quiet show of support. Dale Hutchkins arrived with his lawyer, Garrison. Both men dressed in expensive suits that made Jacob acutely aware of his own simple clothing, his best shirt and pants, clean, but clearly the clothes of a working man. Dale's expression was carefully neutral, but Jacob caught a flicker of something in his eyes when he saw the crowd. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe fear. Judge William Hartford presided, a stern-faced man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness, but also for strictly interpreting the letter of the law. He called the court to order and listened as Garrison laid out Dale's case with practiced eloquence. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of inheritance law," Garrison began. Dale Hutchkins is the sole surviving relative of Sarah Mallister, whose family owned and operated the ranch in question for over 15 years. The Mallister brand is intellectual property that belongs to the Mallister family estate. My client, as the legal heir, has the right to control the use of that brand. Mr. Stone, whatever his good intentions, is using property that does not belong to him. Garrison presented documents establishing Dale's relationship to Sarah, along with records showing that Sarah's sons had never been located after the family left Montana. He argued smoothly and confidently, painting Jacob as a well-meaning but legally ignorant man who had overstepped his rights. When it was Samuel Brooks's turn, he stood slowly, taking a moment to look around the courtroom before speaking. "Your Honor, my colleague is correct that this case involves inheritance law, but it also involves something more fundamental, the question of what we owe to the past, and who has the right to claim a legacy." Brooks pulled out the letter Sarah had hidden in her journal. "I would like to enter into evidence a letter written by Sarah Mallister 2 weeks before she left this valley. In it, she explains why she never spoke of her brother Dale because he had abandoned the family when they needed him most, choosing his new wealthy life over his own blood." Garrison objected immediately. "This letter is hearsay, Your Honor. It cannot be authenticated, and even if it could, it has no bearing on the legal question of inheritance." Judge Hartford considered this. "I'll allow the letter as evidence of the deceased's intent and state of mind, though Mr. Garrison is correct that it does not automatically override inheritance law. Continue, Mr. Brooks." Brooks read portions of the letter aloud, his voice carrying Sarah's words through the hushed courtroom. When he reached the part about Dale refusing to help, about his concern for his social reputation over family loyalty, Jacob saw several people in the audience shake their heads in disgust. Dale's face had gone pale, his jaw clenched tight. Sarah Mallister made her intentions clear. Brooks continued. "She did not want her brother to have this property. She sold it to the bank rather than accept his insulting offer, hoping that someday a good family would make the ranch prosper again. Mr. Stone has done exactly that. He has honored the Mallister legacy through his actions, investing his own labor and resources into restoring what Sarah and John built." Brooks called his first witness, Martha Hayes. She took the stand with quiet dignity and testified about the Mallisters, about the ranch's history, about Jacob's character, and his genuine respect for the property's heritage. Under Brooks's gentle questioning, she painted a vivid picture of a community that had watched Jacob work tirelessly to bring the ranch back to life. "Mrs. Hayes," Brooks asked, "in your opinion, who better honors the memory of Sarah and John Mallister? A man who has poured his heart into restoring their ranch and keeping their name alive, or a man who refused to help them when they were struggling and then tried to buy their land for a fraction of its value after they were forced to leave?" Garrison objected strenuously, arguing that the question called for speculation, but Judge Hartford allowed Martha to answer. She looked directly at Dale as she spoke. Sarah Mallister was my friend. I know what she would want. She would want this land cared for and loved. She would want the Mallister name associated with good work and honest labor. Mr. Stone has given her that her brother never did. Sheriff Brennan was called next, testifying about the pattern of harassment Jacob had endured. The sabotage, the poisoned cow, Dale's public threats, and private intimidation. He presented his records methodically, building a damning picture of Dale's behavior over the past months. When it was Garrison's turn to cross-examine, he tried to undermine the testimony by suggesting that Jacob had no actual proof Dale was responsible for the harassment. But Brennan held firm. Mr. Hutchins confessed to me directly that he had ordered these acts. I have it documented in my official reports. The courtroom erupted in shock murmurs. Judge Hartford had to bang his gavel several times to restore order. Dale slumped in his chair, knowing that his lawyer's careful strategy had just been demolished by his own earlier admission. Brooks then called Jacob to the stand. As Jacob swore to tell the truth, his hand resting on the Bible, he felt surprisingly calm. This was his moment to tell his story, to explain why the ranch and the Mallister name meant so much to him. Brooks led him through his testimony carefully. Jacob described his arrival at the abandoned property, the state of ruin he had found, his decision to restore rather than replace. He talked about discovering Sarah's journal, about learning the history of the family who had built the ranch, about his choice to honor their legacy by keeping their brand alive. Mr. Stone, Brooks asked, "Why did you decide to keep the Mallister brand rather than creating your own?" Jacob thought carefully before answering. "Because this land has a history that matters. Sarah and John Mallister poured their lives into this place. They suffered and struggled and ultimately lost everything through no fault of their own. But the work they did was real and good. The buildings they constructed, the fields they cleared, the legacy they tried to build, all of that deserved to be remembered and honored." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've lost things too, Your Honor. I had a ranch once and a wife I loved more than life. I lost both of them, and I spent years drifting, thinking my life was over. But when I came to this land and read Sarah's words, I understood something. Our losses don't have to be the end of the story. We can build on what came before. We can honor the people who tried and failed. We can prove that their efforts weren't in vain." The courtroom was absolutely silent. As Jacob continued, "The Mallister brand isn't just a mark on an animal's hide. It's a symbol of perseverance and hope. It says that this land has been loved and cared for. That good people tried to make something lasting here. I'm just trying to continue that story to prove that broken things can be mended and abandoned dreams can be fulfilled, even if not by the people who first dreamed them." When Garrison cross-examined, he tried to shake Jacob's testimony, suggesting that his motivation was really about profit, about using the Mallister name for marketing purposes. But Jacob answered each question calmly and honestly, never losing his composure, always bringing the conversation back to respect, legacy, and stewardship. Finally, Garrison asked the question he clearly thought would undermine everything. "Mr. Stone, isn't it true that you have no legal right to the Mallister name? That no matter how much you claim to honor their memory, you are not and never will be a Mallister?" Jacob met his gaze steadily. "That's absolutely true, Mr. Garrison. I'm not a Mallister by blood or by law, but I believe I've earned the right to be a steward of their legacy through my actions, through my respect for what they built, through my determination to make their dream succeed, where circumstances prevented them from doing so themselves." He turned to look at Judge Hartford. "Your Honor, I don't claim to own the Mallister name. I claim only the right to honor it, to use it in the service of making this land prosper, as Sarah and John always hoped it would. If that's not enough in the eyes of the law, then I'll accept your judgment. But I'll never stop believing that what I've done is right." The testimony concluded, and Judge Hartford called for a brief recess before closing arguments. As Jacob stepped down from the witness stand, he felt Ben's hand on his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and pride. Martha smiled at him through tears, and even Sheriff Brennan gave him a subtle nod of approval. Whatever the judge decided, Jacob knew he had spoken the truth from his heart. He had explained why the ranch and its history mattered, why legacy and memory were worth fighting for. The rest was out of his hands, placed in the careful deliberation of the law and the wisdom, or lack thereof, of one territorial Judge Dodd as they waited for court to reconvene. Jacob pulled out Elizabeth's watch and checked the time. It was ticking steadily, faithfully marking the passage of moments, the flow of life continuing forward. He smiled slightly, finding comfort in that steady rhythm, in a reminder that time moved on regardless of individual victories or defeats, that life continued with all its possibilities and challenges. He was ready for the verdict, whatever it might be. The courtroom settled as Judge Hartford returned to the bench. The air was thick with tension, every person present leaning forward slightly, waiting for the words that would determine the fate of the Mallister Ranch and everything Jacob had built. But before Hartford could speak, there was a commotion at the back of the room. Dale Hutchkins stood abruptly, his face ashen, his hands trembling. His lawyer grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back down, but Dale shook him off. "Your Honor." Dale's voice was rough, uncertain. "May I address the court?" Judge Hartford's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Hutchkins, this is highly irregular. You have legal representation." "I know, Your Honor, but there's something I need to say, something that should have been said years ago." Dale stepped forward and Garrison made a desperate grab for his client's coat, whispering urgently, but Dale ignored him completely. Hartford studied Dale for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but I warn you. Anything you say becomes part of the official record." "I understand." Dale walked to the front of the courtroom, standing in the open space before the judge's bench. He did not look at Jacob, could not seem to meet anyone's eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of suppressed guilt. "My name is Dale Hutchkins now, but I was born Dale." "Mallister?" "Sarah was my sister. My older sister, the one who raised me after our parents died. She was more than a sister, really. She was like a mother to me." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I abandoned her when she needed me most." The courtroom was absolutely still. Even Garrison had stopped trying to intervene, realizing that whatever was happening was beyond his control. Now everything in that letter Sarah wrote, it's all true. When she came to me during the drought years, when she begged me for help to save the ranch, I turned her away. I was ashamed of my connection to struggling farmers. I had married into wealth, taken the Hutchkins name, built a new life where I was respected and powerful, and I convinced myself that helping Sarah would jeopardize all of that. Dale's voice cracked slightly. But the truth is, I was just a coward. I was afraid that people would see where I came from, that they would think less of me if they knew my family was failing. So I chose my reputation over my blood. I chose comfort over loyalty, and I've lived with that choice every day for 15 years. He finally looked up, his eyes finding Jacob in the crowd. When Jacob Stone bought the ranch and started restoring it, when he chose to honor my sister's memory by keeping the Mallister name alive, it was like a knife to my heart. Because he, a stranger, cared more about Sarah's legacy than I ever did. He was willing to work himself to exhaustion, to pour his savings and his sweat into that land. While I had refused to lift a finger to help when it would have actually mattered, Dale turned to face Judge Hartford directly. "I brought this lawsuit out of shame. Your Honor, not because I genuinely believe I have a moral right to the Mallister name. I forfeited that right when I abandoned my family. I brought it because I wanted to erase the evidence of my betrayal to make the ranch disappear, so I wouldn't have to be reminded every day of what I failed to do." He drew a shaky breath. But sitting in this courtroom, hearing the testimony, watching Jacob explain what that ranch means to him and why he's fighting for it, I realized something. He's not fighting to own the Mallister name. He's fighting to honor it, to give it the respect and care it deserves. The respect and care I never gave my own family. The silence in the courtroom was profound. Several people were openly crying, moved by Dale's confession. Garrison had his head in his hands, knowing his case was destroyed, but unable to stop what was happening. "I want to withdraw my lawsuit, Your Honor," Dale said clearly. Jacob Stone has every right to the Mallister brand, not because of any legal technicality, but because he's earned it. He's done what I never could. He's made Sarah's dream come true. He's proven that the Mallister Ranch can thrive, that her family's work wasn't in vain. Judge Hartford leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Hutchkins, do you understand what you're doing? Once you withdraw this claim, you cannot refile it. You're giving up any legal right to contest Mr. Stone's use of the brand." "I understand completely, Your Honor, and it's the right thing to do. It's about 15 years too late, but it's still the right thing." Dale turned to face Jacob directly for the first time. "Mr. Stone, I owe you an apology. I've harassed you, sabotaged your work. I've harassed your work, tried to drive you off land that you purchased legally, and have improved with honest labor. I did all of that because I couldn't face my own guilt, because I was too much of a coward to admit what I'd done. He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You asked me once if I ever wished I could undo the past. The answer is yes, every single day. But I can't change what I did to Sarah and John. All I can do is try to make sure I don't compound my failures by destroying what you're building in their honor. Jacob stood slowly, feeling the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. He walked to where Dale stood, the two men facing each other in the space before the judge's bench. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Jacob extended his hand. Thank you for telling the truth. I know that took courage. Dale stared at the offered hand as if he could not quite believe it was real. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not, Jacob agreed, but I'm offering it anyway. Because I've learned something these past months. Holding on to anger and guilt doesn't honor the people we've lost. It just keeps us trapped in the past. Sarah wouldn't want that for you any more than my wife would want it for me. Slowly, hesitantly, Dale took Jacob's hand. The handshake was brief, awkward, weighted with years of complicated emotion, but it was genuine, a first step towards something that might, with time, become reconciliation. Judge Hartford cleared his throat, bringing the room's attention back to the bench. Well, this is certainly the most unusual case I've presided over in 30 years on the bench. He looked at Dale. Mr. Hutchkins, I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you certain you wish to withdraw your claim? Absolutely certain, Your Honor. Very well. The case is dismissed. Mr. Stone, you retain full legal right to use the Mallister brand without restriction. Hartford paused, then added in a softer tone. And may I say for the record that this court finds your stewardship of the Mallister legacy to be exemplary. You've shown this community what it means to honor the past while building for the future. The courtroom erupted in applause. Martha was crying openly now, and Ben was grinning like he had just won the lottery. Sheriff Brennan nodded with satisfaction, and even some of the people who had been Dale's supporters looked moved by what they had witnessed. As the crowd began to disperse, Samuel Brooks approached Jacob with a broad smile. Well, that's one for the history books. I've never seen anything quite like it. He paused, then added more seriously. You did a remarkable thing today. Mr. Stone not just winning your case, but offering grace to a man who tried to destroy you. That takes a special kind of strength. Or a special kind of stubborn foolishness? Jacob replied with a slight smile. I'm still not sure which. Does it matter? The result is the same justice was served, mercy was offered, and two men got a chance to make peace with their pasts. Brooks shook Jacob's hand firmly. If you ever need legal help again, you know where to find me, though I hope you won't need it. As Brooks departed, Dale approached hesitantly, his lawyer conspicuously absent. Apparently, Garrison had stormed off the moment the case was dismissed. Dale stood awkwardly, clearly unsure what to say now that the formal proceedings were over. Mr. Stone, I meant what I said in there about the apology, about everything. I know words can't undo the harm I've caused, but I want you to know I'm going to stop fighting you. The harassment, the sabotage, all of it, it's over. I appreciate that, Jacob said simply. Dale nodded, then seemed to wrestle with something internal before speaking again. I wonder, would you consider allowing me to help with the ranch sometimes? Not as an owner or even a partner, just as I don't know someone trying to make amends. I could provide resources, labor, whatever you need. No strings attached, no expectation of ownership or control. Just a chance to do something good with the Mallister name the way I should have done 15 years ago. Jacob considered this carefully. Part of him wanted to refuse to keep Dale at arm's length to protect what he had built from any potential interference. But another part, the part that had just offered forgiveness, that had wound Elizabeth's watch and chosen to move forward, understood that real redemption required action, not just words. Let me think about it, Jacob said. Honestly, this is all very fresh and I need time to process it. But I'm not saying no. I'm just saying not yet. That's more than I deserve, Dale replied quietly. Thank you. As Dale walked away, Ben approached with Martha in tow. The young man was practically vibrating with excitement. We won, Mr. Stone. We actually won. We did. Jacob agreed, feeling the weight of tension he had been carrying for weeks finally lift from his shoulders. We did indeed. Martha hugged him tightly, something she had never done before. Thomas would be so proud of you, Jacob. So proud of what you've accomplished here. Thank you, Martha, for everything, the support, the supplies, the faith in me when I had none in myself. I couldn't have done any of this without you. As they walked out of the courthouse together into the afternoon sun, Jacob felt something he had not felt in longer than he could remember. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The ranch was his. The brand was protected. And he had a community of people who believed in what he was building. He pulled out Elizabeth's watch and checked the time. 4:30 in the afternoon. Time to head back to the ranch, to check on the cattle, to plan for the planting of winter wheat, to continue the endless work of building a life worth living. The watch ticked steadily in his palm, and Jacob smiled. Time was moving forward, carrying him with it into an uncertain but hopeful future. And for the first time in 6 years, he was ready to embrace whatever that future might bring. 6 months had passed since the courthouse confrontation, and autumn had returned to the Montana Territory. The Mallister Ranch stood transformed under the golden light of October, no longer a ruin, but a thriving homestead that drew admiring comments from everyone who passed by. Jacob stood at the newly constructed ranch entrance, watching as Ben and 2 younger men he had hired, brothers named Tom and Charlie, who had needed work and direction, raised a sign they had spent weeks crafting. It was made of solid oak, the letters carved deep and painted black for visibility. It read Mallister Ranch established 1867, restored 1885. The sign honored both the past and the present, acknowledging the original builders while marking the ranch's rebirth. It was Ben's idea, and Jacob had loved it immediately. It captured exactly what they had accomplished. Not replacement, but renewal. Not eraser, but continuation. Little to the left, Jacob called out, and the young men adjusted their grip. There, perfect. As they secured the sign to its posts, Jacob felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Dale Hutchkins standing beside him, dressed in work clothes rather than his usual expensive attire. Over the past months, Dale had become an unexpected but valued presence at the ranch, appearing once or twice a week to help with whatever work needed doing. He never gave orders or tried to take control. He simply worked quietly and steadily, a man trying to make amends through action rather than words. The arrangement had been awkward at first, but gradually a kind of peace had developed between them. They were not friends exactly, but they had become something more complex. 2 men bound by shared history and shared purpose, learning to build something good out of the wreckage of the past. "It's a fine sign," Dale said quietly. Sarah would have liked it. "I think so too," Jacob agreed. They stood together in companionable silence, watching as the young men finished securing the sign. The ranch spread out before them, a testament to months of relentless labor and careful stewardship. The house was fully restored now, with a new roof, repaired siding, and windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The barn stood solid and weatherproof, filled with hay for the winter and home to a steadily growing herd of cattle. The fields, already plowed and planted with winter wheat, showed the green promise of next year's crop. But more than the physical improvements, the ranch had become something Jacob had never quite expected. A home not just for himself, but for others who needed one. Ben had become like a son to him. The young man's reading skills now advanced enough that he helped Jacob with the ranch accounts and correspondence. Tom and Charlie, 2 brothers who had been drifting through the territory with no clear direction, and found purpose in the steady work in the community Jacob was building. Even Martha Hayes spent Sunday afternoons at the ranch now, bringing supplies and staying for dinner, filling the house with warmth and laughter that had been absent for too many years. Thought. Sheriff Brennan rode up as the sign was being admired, dismounting with a smile. "Heard you were raising the new sign today. Wanted to see it myself." He studied the carved letters approvingly. "Fine work. The whole valley's talking about what you've done here. Jacob, you've become something of a legend. The man who brought the dead ranch back to life." "It was never dead," Jacob replied. "Just sleeping. Just waiting for someone to care enough to wake it up." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the small group gathered on the newly rebuilt porch for an impromptu celebration. Martha had brought food from town, fresh bread, smoked ham, apple pie made with fruit from her own tree. Dale contributed a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. The young men brought their music. Charlie played fiddle while Tom sang in a clear, pleasant voice dot. It was a simple gathering, nothing fancy or formal, just people who had come to care about each other, sharing a moment of joy and accomplishment. As they ate and talked and listened to the music, Jacob felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. He had come to this place broken and alone, expecting nothing but hard work and solitude. Instead, he had found family, community, purpose, everything he thought he had lost forever. When Elizabeth died, as the evening deepened and the first stars appeared, the others gradually departed until only Jacob and Ben remained on the porch. They sat in comfortable silence. Two men who had traveled different roads to arrive at the same place, a ranch that represented second chances and new beginnings. "Mr. Stone," Ben said eventually, "I've been thinking about something and I wanted to ask your permission." "What's that?" "I'd like to write to my sister Sarah, tell her about this place, about what we're building here, and I'd like to invite her to come visit. Maybe even stay if she wants. She's still with our aunt in Cheyenne, but I think maybe she'd like to have a real home, a place where she feels safe and wanted." Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. Ben had been sending occasional letters to his sister, short notes to let her know he was all right. But this was different. This was Ben claiming his place here as permanent, as home, and offering to share that home with the family he still had. "I think that's a fine idea," Jacob said warmly. "This place has room for anyone who needs it. Your sister would be welcome here." Ben nodded, clearly relieved and pleased. "Thank you for everything. Really, you saved my life, Mr. Stone, not just by giving me work, but by showing me that good men still exist in the world, that it's possible to build something decent and true, even when everything seems hopeless. You saved mine, too. Ben, you reminded me that I still had something to offer, that my life wasn't over just because I'd lost what I loved. We saved each other, I think." They sat together as the night deepened. The ranch quiet around them, except for the sounds of cattle settling and the wind moving through the grass. Jacob pulled out Elizabeth's watch and checked the time by the light of the lamp. 8:30. The hands moved smoothly, steadily, marking the passage of moments that were building into a life he had never expected to have again. He thought about Elizabeth often, but the memories no longer came with the same crushing weight of guilt and grief. He could remember her laughter without feeling like he was betraying her by being happy. He could honor what they had built together while also celebrating what he was building now. The past and the present had finally made peace with each other, allowing him to move forward without feeling like he was leaving her behind. A coyote called in the distance, and another answered the eternal song of the Montana wilderness. The ranch lights glowed warm against the darkness, a beacon of human persistence and hope in the vast landscape. The Mallister brand marked cattle in the corral, a symbol of continuity and renewal, of dreams that could survive even when the dreamers could not. Jacob stood and stretched, feeling the pleasant ache of a day's honest work in his aging muscles. "Time for bed," he said. "Morning comes early and we've got fence to mend in the north pasture." Mr. Stone Ben's voice was quiet but earnest. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd given up? If you'd sold to Hutchkins when he first offered?" Jacob considered this sometimes, but I try not to dwell on it. The path not taken is just speculation. What matters is the path we actually walked, the choices we actually made. I chose to stay, to fight, to build, and that choice led to all of this. To you, to the ranch, to the life we're creating here. That's enough for me." He paused at the door, looking back at the young man who had become like family. "Get some rest, Ben. Tomorrow's a new day and we've got work to do." Inside the house that he had restored with his own hands, Jacob prepared for bed in the room he had repaired and furnished. He placed Elizabeth's watch on the small table beside his bed, listening to its steady tick in the darkness. It was a comforting sound, a reminder that time continued, that life moved forward, that every moment was a new opportunity to build something good. As he lay down to sleep, Jacob's last thoughts were not of what he had lost, but of what he had gained. A ranch restored to life, a young man given direction and hope, a community that had rallied around a stranger, a man who had been his enemy, learning to become something better, and for himself, a future that held promise rather than just the echoes of the past. The Mallister Ranch would endure. The name would live on, carried forward by people who understood that legacy was not about blood or ownership, but about love, respect, and the willingness to do the hard work of building something that mattered. Jacob Stone, who had arrived broken and alone, fell asleep, surrounded by the evidence of his own capacity for renewal. The ranch breathed around him, the house he had rebuilt, the land he had restored, the community he had helped create. It was all real, all substantial, all proof that redemption was possible for people and places alike. Tomorrow, the work would continue as it always did on a working ranch. There would be challenges to face, problems to solve, seasons to weather. But Jacob would face them with strength born of experience, supported by people who had become family, grounded in the knowledge that he had already survived the worst and emerged stronger. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The wind whispered through the valley, and in a house that had once stood empty and forgotten, a man who had given up on happiness discovered that sometimes the best stories are about things that were lost and then found again, not unchanged, but transformed into something even better than they were before.